Hey folks, today I'll be reviewing Donkey Kong Country 2. This video builds upon my analysis of the original Donkey Kong Country. If you haven't watched it yet, I recommend that you do prior to watching this video. Donkey Kong Country 2 was released in 1995 for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Leveraging the same core engine as its predecessor, it builds upon established design patterns and adds additional content and gameplay depth. We can think of the original game as the foundation for this one. It demonstrated how the intellectual property would be used, established the core gameplay mechanics, and fleshed out the technical details of building a polished game. Its position as the first entry in the series encouraged a conservative design. Rare's first priority was making players feel comfortable in the game world. Donkey Kong Country 2 takes the make it better philosophy of the original game and strips away the cautious design trade-offs made to ease players into the experience. In many ways, we can think of Donkey Kong Country 2 as the first authentic Donkey Kong Country game. It's the first in the series that wasn't shackled by the risks of building a brand new franchise. The boss fights are the best example of this newly liberated design approach. They require more precise timings and cleaner execution than the original. The designers were comfortable substantially raising the game's skill floor by upping the mechanical difficulty. The addition of multiple stages and unique boss mechanics further increases the difficulty by forcing players to figure out what they need to do. The designers took a risk here. The saving mechanic allows players to game over in a newly discovered world. This has potential for tiresome repeat encounters with the same boss, so the original game streamlined these fights to ensure they weren't a real obstacle. Donkey Kong Country 2 goes in the opposite direction, betting that players will prefer a more meaningful gameplay experience at the risk that they might have to do it again. This is a much stronger design, and one that's relatively safe to implement once the core gameplay has proven its appeal. It forces the developers to build content that's meaningful to replay, essential in a game that already emphasizes secrets and bonus rooms. More generally, it's focused on building something good rather than avoiding something bad. This philosophy extends throughout the entire experience. Donkey Kong Country 2 is substantially more difficult than its predecessor, particularly the levels in the Lost World. Sequels face a tough design challenge in appropriately level setting their difficulty for the entire player base. Veterans of previous games will demand a much tougher experience than most new players will find comfortable, but the designer ultimately needs to cater to both audiences. The proliferation of modal difficulty settings came about to try to solve this problem by differentiating the experience based on the player's skill level, but time has shown this approach to be somewhat fragile. It multiplies the work required to balance the game and usually produces a more watered-down experience. Rare opted against this approach. Donkey Kong Country 2 benefited from its place late in the life cycle of the Super Nintendo, allowing the designers to bank on the majority of their player base having enough experience to handle a significantly more difficult game. One of its most fundamental changes was to the core reward loop of the original, wherein a challenge could be observed, overcome, and then reflected upon from a moment of safety. The sequel frequently modifies the last step by immediately prompting the player to take a new action due to impending danger. Some of the biggest rewards come from completing long, continuous sequences of individual challenges that were strung together by forcing the player to continue moving forward. This is especially noticeable in levels that emphasize a specific mechanic rather than just general gameplay. This is actually a differentiation that I first noticed in the original game. Over time, levels shifted their focus from core gameplay toward individual mechanics. The levels that emphasize lighting were the best example. They took a specific gameplay mechanic and built an entire level around it. That said, the original game still preferred to judiciously mix in plenty of core gameplay to avoid gimmicks, consistent with a preference for caution in order to avoid problems. Donkey Kong Country 2 sheds this cautious approach completely. The second half of the game is mostly mechanic-driven levels, with the last few eschewing core platforming entirely. The development team didn't lose its focus on depth. Forcing themselves to push a single mechanic to its limits ensured that weaker ideas were pruned prior to release. Focusing a level around a single idea also helped prevent its overuse, contributing to the title's replayability. This approach to level design extends into the animal companions as well. The original game structured animal buddies like tools, a novel approach that was overshadowed by the clash of wills it created. On the one hand, the player was happy to discover a secret. At the same time, they were also worried about losing it. Allowing players to make decisions and consider trade-offs is often a good mechanic because it builds player agency. but the player felt no sense of agency from finding an animal, since they knew that losing it likely meant missing out on a secret. The lack of a decision-making mechanic meant that animals sometimes felt like more trouble than they were worth. Rather than try to solve this problem, Donkey Kong Country 2 simply allows the player to take full control of the Kong's animal friends. This means players no longer need to fear losing their buddy, allowing them to play more loosely and take additional risks. Subjectively, I definitely feel a stronger connection to Squawks and Squitter than I ever did to Espresso or Winky, and I think the redesign here is part of the reason. By taking away the worry of losing them, I could instead focus on the animal's core mechanics and the unique perspective they brought to the gameplay. One of the more interesting inclusions here is the addition of special abilities, which add further depth to the animal companion's gameplay. These are introduced through the use of banana-shaped tutorials that indicate the button a player should press in order to use an ability. I'm usually critical of explicit tutorials because they indicate a failure to make the controls self-explanatory. Their placement here is less of an issue because they're implemented as an in-game item. It's less immersion breaking when tutorials are part of the experience rather than separate from it. The developer messages in Demon's Souls are a good example of doing this seamlessly. Players may not even know that a message is a tutorial until they play offline and realize that it's always present. The introduction of the team-up mechanic is a good example of the flaws in this design approach, particularly when compared with the original game. Donkey Kong Country's more conservative approach had the advantage of prompting the designers to carefully design the first level in such a way that the game's core mechanics were self-evident. The sequel lacked this kind of forcing function, so the designers ended up using sloppier banana tutorials to get their message across. The coin here is out of reach, indicating that the player needs to find a way to jump higher than they would normally. There are a number of subtle issues the designer needs to consider. How will the player learn the new mechanic if they had previously lost their teammate? What if they assume that this is similar to the first game, and fruitlessly search for something to bounce on? What if they simply skip by this section and miss this idea completely? The designers chose to plaster the screen with bananas shaped like the letter A next to the coin, which only partially solves the above problems. A better approach would be to use a Dixie Kong barrel in place of the coin. This clearly conveys that a teammate is needed. It's more noticeable, ensuring that players don't just run past it. Players who attempt to switch teammates will quickly realize that the switch button has been moved, indicating that there's something new on the A button. All this is conveyed to the player without directly telling them a single thing. Once they figure it out, they feel smart and get rewarded with their first bonus room. My intention here isn't to make a serious criticism of the game, this is a minor point. Instead, it's to emphasize the deferring approach the development team had to this game relative to the original. The cautious philosophy adopted in the first game sometimes acted to make the game better, simply because it forced the developers to really think through what they were trying to accomplish at any given time. I think if this were the original game, the introduction to Team Up would have been much better executed. Tutorials aside, Donkey Kong Country 2 introduces a number of new gameplay mechanics. Team Up is probably the most significant. Relative to the first game, it effectively doubles the vertical space available to the level designer. This is used very effectively to build a more engaging experience. It incentivizes players to focus on the game world and study it carefully. The addition of new platforming space means that levels can be less dense, allowing the designers to include secrets in a more natural way. Virtually every bonus room is hinted at to some degree. This makes finding them feel especially good because you're consciously aware of your good observational skill. Probably the only miss here is the occasionally inconsistent level design. I would expect to be able to safely drop down here since I do so later in the level, but because this is progression breaking, I'm prevented from doing so. The team-up mechanic also incentivizes players to keep both Kongs alive throughout an entire level, making them feel more like partners than an extra life. This is important because the clear differentiation between the two Kongs was minimized this time around. Diddy feels slightly faster and more agile, but nothing in the game feels so fast that it's impossible to get through with Dixie. Meanwhile, Dixie's hover ability is incredibly useful and trivializes a number of the title's difficult sections. There's actually no point in the game where I would rather have Diddy over Dixie, but Team Up ensures that both Kongs still feel useful, making this less noticeable unless you really think about it. The rest of the new mechanics serve to deepen the core gameplay rather than act as gimmicks. Invincibility barrels enable further exploration, invisible items encourage experimentation, moving barrels add flavor to the existing barrel mechanics, and so on. The title achieves breadth through its diverse set of mechanic-focused levels that allow players to experience a wide variety of gameplay. Outside of these levels, these mechanics are rarely the focal point. They're a complement to the core gameplay. Probably the biggest mechanic change from the original game is a major redesign of rewards. A currency system creates decision-making mechanics and NPC interactions. A creme coin system rewards thorough players with additional content, and DK coins reward player exploration. These systems combine to produce a significantly more satisfying experience than the original game. Donkey Kong Country featured many of these same ideas: hidden content, bonus rooms, collectible items, and so on. The problem is that none of them felt particularly meaningful because they didn't have any meaningful rewards. As a result, the player had little incentive to collect them, and instead was implicitly encouraged to simply move from level to level in quick succession. Donkey Kong Country 2 fixes these problems by rewarding the player for their exploration. This has the effect of making the game feel deeper than it otherwise could be. It's easy to forget that many of its levels can be rushed straight through, much like the original game. The difference is that players don't want to do this, because they would rather explore their surroundings in the hope of finding a collectible item. The creme coin system is particularly interesting because it gates content behind the discovery of secrets. The concept of gated content is another challenging design trade-off for the designer. It's a great way to reward the title's most dedicated players, but it essentially guarantees that some content won't be experienced by the entire player base. In fact, in contrast with late game content that has a similar problem, the exclusivity of gated content is part of its appeal. Players like to feel like they're discovering something new that not everyone else has experienced. The development team tackled this problem in a really intelligent way. The 5 levels in the Lost World can be completed in any order. As long as players can find 15 creme coins in a single playthrough, they can access any level they want. More casual players don't feel excluded, while dedicated players still get a sense of specialness from unlocking the secret ending. They're also further rewarded by a unique 101% completion at the end of their playthrough. I don't think this middle-of-the-road approach would work for every game, and generally I think the benefits of gated content outweigh the risks of casual players feeling like they missed out on something. But if a compromise solution is desired, this is an excellent one. Ironically, one of the biggest effects of the redesigned reward system is on the title's replayability. Meaningful rewards in combination with clear progression indicators make it both enjoyable and straightforward to hunt down all of the game's secrets. This means the type of player who would replay the game is also fairly likely to 101% it by the end of their first playthrough, reducing the value in replaying it again. The way I think about this is the way value in a game is distributed across multiple playthroughs. I don't think this title has less overall value than the original game, just the opposite in fact. But this time around, the value is more concentrated in the first playthrough. Donkey Kong Country 2's last major redesign is in its pacing. The one-way progression of the original game was replaced by branching paths that incentivize a slower, more thoughtful approach to moving through the game world. Nearly every level connects to a new NPC, whose interactions were also redesigned to be more meaningful. The greatest benefit of this approach is its consistency. The same thoughtful mindset that players carry into levels is maintained outside of them. Saving after each level doesn't feel jarring when the player was probably going to visit a new NPC anyway. My point here isn't to say that the pacing is particularly brilliant. A player who's trying to avoid a game over in a new world probably isn't in the right mindset to take a break after a tough level, knowing their progress hasn't yet been saved. What's important is that the pacing is consistent. It lacks the uneven and jarring interactions of the original game, and allows the player to more comfortably immerse themselves in the game world. The NPCs themselves are also much better implemented this time around, with the currency system engaging players by creating interesting opportunities for decision making. Swanky is my particular favorite. He's the first in the Rare tradition of including quiz games in their titles. Part of the charm of Rare's games is the way the gameplay blends with the music, art, and writing, yet most players usually perceive these as secondary features, if they're consciously aware of them at all. The quiz games not only encourage the player to pay more attention, but they also reward the many staff members whose work may be less noticeable. As a huge fan of Rare titles, I'm acutely aware of how important these folks are to a game's underlying charm and the sense of enjoyment players feel as they move through the game world. There are probably better ways of appreciating them, but this is a good start. While we're on the subject of the art style, it's worth calling out some of the improvements made in the sequel. Donkey Kong Country 2 leverages the same core engine as the original game, so its graphical changes are purely incremental. A side-by-side comparison shows that the sequel's core modeling is essentially the same as the original, but additional environmental detail and more complicated animations were added to make the experience just that much better. Donkey Kong Country 2 takes the foundation built by the first game and applies a no-holds-barred approach to building a sequel. The areas that worked well in the original remain intact, whereas the core problems were significantly redesigned. The result is what most fans dream about when they think about a sequel. Roughly the same thing as the original, with all the problems fixed and a bunch of new content. The emphasis on building something good rather than avoiding something bad enabled the team to nail their vision of the ideal Donkey Kong Country game. That's everything I had for today. Next time, we'll be looking at Donkey Kong Country 3. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving me a follow here or on Twitter to receive regular content updates. You can find the relevant links in the description. All the best, and see you next time.